The Commemoration Without Decolonization, a critical discussion on public memorializations organized by the International Council on Monuments and Sites, or ICOMOS Philippines, as part of this year's celebration of the International Day of Monuments and Sites last April 18. For today's event, our moderator will be Architect Dominic Galicia. Architect Dom is a licensed architect in the Philippines and principal architect at Dominic Galicia Architects. He is the immediate past president of ICOMOS Philippines from 2014 to 2017. Let us welcome Architect Dominic Dom Galicia.
Thank you, everyone, for being here this morning. It's good to see so many new faces in the room. As an international organization with national committees in 153 countries, ICOMOS is part of a global conversation on the currents and movements of heritage conservation. And we come together in our respective countries to discuss these currents and movements. On a day that UNESCO, in its 1982 General Conference, established as the International Day of Monuments and Sites. It is my happy task to introduce our speaker for today's event. Lila Shahani is an expert member of the International Scientific Committee for the Interpretation and Presentation of Cultural Heritage Sites at ICOMOS. She is also an associate member of ICOMOS International Scientific Committee for Intangible Cultural Heritage. Lila has taught at several universities in the Philippines and abroad, most recently at the University of Washington in Seattle. She has also worked for the United Nations in New York and as an assistant secretary in the Philippine cabinet for over a decade. Her last government position was as Secretary General of the Philippine National Commission to UNESCO, where she oversaw the inscription of 4 UNESCO designations for the Philippines in intangible cultural heritage, memory of the world, and creative cities. Lila has several forthcoming publications on heritage and human rights with Routledge, Brill, Bloomsbury, and Bergan books coming out later this year. Let us welcome our speaker for today, Ms. Lila Ramos Shahani.
Thank you so much, Dom. It's a pleasure to be here. I want to thank ICOMOS Philippines and Dom, Eric, Tina. I really appreciate the invitation. So I want to start by talking about what it is that people consider to be sacrosanct. What do we consider to be sacred? Why do we have to create things that we deem sacred? And how do we react when those icons are put into question? And I propose that architecture is the performance of memory. And it is also the performance of the erasure of memory. So if we look at our own history and trauma, memory, it's very valuable to look at monuments to see what certain civilizations, certain cultures considered to be worth remembering and what they didn't. Next slide, please. So I want to start by talking about the notion of iconoclasm. And iconoclasm goes back centuries, and there's frequently been a big debate about the one true God versus false gods. And you see it in not only major religions, but so many different anthropological groups. So there is this, and I want to preface my talk by talking about the discourse of us versus them, right? And the one true God is our religion versus the others who don't necessarily follow the belief systems that we consider to be important. So iconoclasm is really about those who critique others worshiping idols, right? So if I believe that your belief system is flawed, I may feel the need to destroy your icons and images and your monuments. And iconoclasm primarily was spurred by this self-righteous religious sentiment. Next. So you can see in this image, in Catholicism, you have Saint Benedict, who's evangelizing his flock. But you see in the detail on the right, you have the monks with him who are taking down an image of the god Apollo, who was worshipped in the Roman Empire. So that is one example of iconoclasm. Next. Political iconoclasm is often called damnatio memoriae. In Latin, literally the condemnation of memory. So it's about the official practice of erasing a public figure's historical imprint in state records. So as you see from this piece, this is the Severan Tondo, and it's very complicated, but essentially Emperor Severus was unhappy with one of his sons, and as you can see, the face is literally defaced. Next slide. So we see it not only in the Western world, you see it in post-Soviet states, in the former East Bloc, and certainly in parts of the global South. So as a resistance to colonial history. So, you know, for example, this is interesting. This is the figure on the left, Lenin, you know, coupled in Kiev in 2013. So you can see the resistance to Russian expansionism even at that period. There was a resistance to the imperial sentiments of Russia in the Ukraine at that time. And of course, another example of iconoclasm is the toppling of Saddam's statue in 2013 during the Battle of Baghdad. Next slide. And one of the more historically important, at least as far as UNESCO is concerned, one of the more important forms of iconoclasm was the destruction of the Buddhas of Bamiyan by the Taliban in Afghanistan. Next. So fast forward to today, what are contemporary examples of iconoclasm? So we might say that in the context of the Black Lives Matter movement, and the movement certainly did not begin in the 20s, it's been going on for decades, but it reached a particular pitch when George Floyd, was put in a chokehold in 2020, and he died in Minnesota. And so the feverish pitch and the anger that really dates back to the Civil War in the US, or even before, arguably, reached its height. And as you all know, there's this global phenomenon of where Black Lives Matter movement was relevant not only in the US, but all over the world. So as an example, in the UK, you have the statue of Edward Colston, which was pulled down in Bristol before it was flung into the River Avon in 2020. Next slide. So in the US, you see all of these protests that have been going on, but again, in the context of the feverish pitch I was referring to after the death of George Floyd, you see numerous Confederate monuments being taken down. And certainly this is one example where Robert E. Lee's statue was taken down in 2021 in Virginia. Next slide. So how does this affect Filipinos? I mean, why does this even matter? Well, I mean, if you think about Black Lives Matter as a form of protest against European expansionism and the slave trade and the abuse of indigenous peoples, then really you're talking about oppression on many different levels. And I would argue, not to be make messy analogies here, but if we're talking about empowerment and disempowerment and the oppression of large swaths of human beings, then racism in the Western world is relevant for those in the Philippines. If you look at it from the prism of ethnicity, class, religion, and gender. Certainly, I think that not many Filipinos were particularly concerned about the Black Lives Matter movement because, again, as I brought up earlier, there is this notion of, on the planet, really, of this us versus them, and our concerns are pertinent and their concerns are not. And it's certain neurobiologists talk about it, calling it a neurobiological antagonism to difference, that you immediately are hardwired to create hierarchies in your mind. And in that hierarchy, you, the subject, are much higher than others around you. And certainly, I think that in the chaotic universe in which we now find ourselves, people need to find simple things to hold on to. As T.S. Eliot once said, consequently, we rejoice, having to construct something upon which to rejoice. So it's possible that in the Philippines, a lack of interest in Black Lives Matter may have to do with our own colorism, our own concerns with fairness, our own colonial mentality. And certainly Filipinos in the Philippines and those abroad don't necessarily have similar priorities. I think racial antagonism in the rest of the world for Filipinos is important. I think in the Philippines, there is a preoccupation with pressing material needs, which is completely understandable. Next slide. So again, if architecture is the performance of memory making and its erasure, then what do the inclusions and exclusions of monuments convey, right? If Black Lives Matter is precisely about linking decolonization with decommemoration, right? Pulling down monuments, why has there been so little discussion about colonial monuments in the Philippines? Why so little discussion about historical markers that accompany them? And since we are not a heavily monumental culture, which I will discuss later, I'm not necessarily advocating that we pull monuments down, but I am suggesting that our historical markers are going to have to convey much more complexity than they currently do. So I would argue that we are in a post-colonial, we like to think we're in a post-colonial moment, right? But the fact of the matter is, on so many profound levels, we haven't decolonized. So my question that I pose to you is, what narratives do we consider do we privilege, and what are privileged? And in return, what social histories are considered to be less grievable? And when I say less grievable, I'm talking about Judith Butler's proposition that some lives are considered to be more grievable than others. And it goes back to that notion of us versus them. Our lives are important. Whoever the other is less grievable. And that's pertinent. And she talks about it in the context of, 9/11 and the trauma for Americans, which is certainly understandable. But there were so many other cultures that experienced trauma, but somehow they certainly got a lot less airtime in the media. Next slide. So I want to talk about iconoclasm in the Philippines. Have we had examples of iconoclasm? Certainly, it's primarily political and not religious, and primarily directed at Filipino leaders. And I would argue that political leaders ultimately are answerable to economic puppeteers. So there is this tendency among many to immediately point fingers at specific political leaders. But I would suggest that if you follow the money, the puppeteers, even if political administrations change, even so-called revolutions, the oligarchy remains very much the same, very much entrenched. So there is elite capture, but certainly in the Philippines, you see iconoclasm in the form of, the destruction of the Marcos bust in 2002. With a great deal, prior to that, of course, there had been a great deal, an efflorescence of protest art and literature, a lot of people who went underground. And of course, there was the storming of Malacanang. So I'm expanding the notion of iconoclasm beyond pulling down of monuments, precisely because the Philippines is not necessarily what you would call a monumental, monument building is not necessarily central to pre-Hispanic and pre-colonial Philippine cultures. Next slide, please. So you have this Marcos defacement. I think one place where you see a great deal of iconoclasm is in the State of the Nation addresses, the saunas where people are always burning and displaying effigies. And certainly there are protests against primarily American, Japanese, and Chinese interference, but not so much Spanish. Next slide, please. And we'll talk about that later. So in the Philippines, you have certain celebrated examples that I certainly found very interesting. You have Medeo Cruz, where he juxtaposed a portrait of the gun-toting Duterte onto the image of the Sacred Heart. So that's, it's like the story of Oedipus, where you kill the father and you bond with the mother. And Freud followed Sophocles, and certainly the idea of pissing in the face of the father is relevant to Western notions of modernism. Everybody is replacing somebody else. So if you're looking at art history, it's like Romanticism, and then Impressionism, and then Post-Impressionism, and then Expressionism, and it's always redoing things in a different way, often entailing dismissal of the past. In the Philippines, we are very interesting because we are, to some degree, we're very Asian in the sense that we don't do it that violently. And there's more of an accommodation, which I will talk about later. But for now, Manuel Ocampo's Why I Hate Europeans is a wonderful example of resisting European expansionism in the Philippines. And you see on the lower right of the painting, you see the sunny white product used to whiten nurses' shoes, which is an allusion to the whitewashing of colonial violence. Next slide. So my question is, why are there relatively few critiques of colonialism in the world of monuments and sites, of religion, and of nationalism? I'm not suggesting that these are necessarily negative things. I am suggesting that we scrutinize all sacred cows and consider why they are sacred and what impels us to invest in their sanctity. Now, it's very interesting to me that someone like Jose Rizal, who we all consider to be many of us consider to be the de facto national hero of the Philippines. I mean, in the Noli and Fili, there are so many trenchant anti-clerical attacks, right? And again, we like to think we're so Westernized, we're so Europeanized, but the fact of the matter is, where are the examples of, the decade of the 1890s in Europe and existentialism and Marxism? And Marxism you see, but this critique of thought systems like religion, we don't see so much of. Another thing that I find surprising is that we all say, people in the academic world and in the non-academic world say, oh, Ben Anderson, Imagine Communities, it's such a groundbreaking, stellar work. But the fact of the matter is that he himself says that, a community is an imagined construct. A nation is an imagined construct. And he critiques official nationalism because it leads precisely to authoritarianism. So my question is, where are the critiques of this very formulaic nationalism that is ultimately, to my mind, patriarchal and often very romantic? And often the romanticism is not empirical. Now, how do these questions relate to monuments and sites? Next slide. So, if you're thinking of decolonizing, I would venture to propose a few examples where I would certainly start, right? If a given is that because of our colonial history with Spain and Japan and Britain and the US, and now the incursions of China, we have had a very complicated colonial history. But primarily, we tend to privilege Hispano-Catholicism, American formal education, and Tagalog or Filipino and Visayan languages, cultures, and notions of nation. But what about all the plazas and churches built during Spanish rule? And again, I understand that I may be pilloried for criticizing these sacred cows, but I'm not suggesting their destruction. I am just suggesting that we scrutinize them and our response to them. So if, in a Socratic sense, everything is subject to scrutiny, then why not look at churches and plazas built during Spanish rule? Now, we have the Legazpi Urdaneta Monument honoring Miguel Lopez de Legazpi, right? Who conquered Cebu and Manila. So what does the commemoration of that act of conquering suggest about those who erected the monument? Is it the case that they consider the act of violence that civilized them to be a good thing? Next slide, please. And of course, there's so much talk about Magellan by the National Historical Commission. But when you talk about the discovery of the Philippines, when there had been so many ethno-linguistic groups prior to Magellan's arrival, I understand the desire to connect with Spain and Portugal, and certainly the rest of Latin America on the part of government cultural agencies. But I would suggest that it's absolutely imperative that when you commemorate these things, you also discuss at the same time the violent displacements that took place under colonial rule. So when we talk about the galleon trade, and certainly there's a great deal of interest in the galleon trade at UNESCO and elsewhere, it's important that it not only commemorates the Spanish and Mexican merchants who profited from it. We also need to hear the discourses of the Chinese traders and the Filipino laborers who made the entire enterprise possible. Next slide. So what about honoring of the United States? I mean, certainly we have, gone through a great deal of wanting to change street names, and make them more nationalist. But, there are certain glaring examples like the American Cemetery, Taft Avenue, Forbes Park, etc., etc. And, I Shall Return and Hailing MacArthur, which is a very complicated thing when you start to read about MacArthur's knowledge of comfort women and how that was put under the table because after the war, there was a desire to bring Japan into the fold in the fight against Russia during the Cold War. So in the Philippines, you see numerous monuments and sites honoring Japan. And alarmingly, you even have this kamikaze statue in Pampanga. Next slide. And I will say about that statue of the kamikaze pilot, again, I have no objection to people putting up whatever they want. I mean, that's everyone's prerogative, and I would not recommend censoring anything. On the other hand, I am really, it is with some chagrin that I observe that no government agency has bothered to write a corrective marker to put that monument into context. So what we see in the Philippines, and this is very important, is that it's not so much the metaphorical killing of the father. What you see is a logic of addition, continuous accretion, not subtraction. And so in terms of the discourse of power, it's not a dialectical unhinging of power. It's a reactionary assertion. So what you see in the Philippines, apart from anti-Marcos gestures, is that the decommemoration of monuments tends to come from above and not from below. And certainly, and we'll talk about this later, bronze and stone monuments are not necessarily central to early Philippine cultures. So you see this anti-colonial and anti-state subversion in other types of spaces and practices. Next slide, please. I'm rushing now because I'm told that I have to hurry up. So, okay, so this is a very brief history, and I'm going to whiz through it so I can get to my main point. So, monument building, brief history in the Philippines. We have this complex, linguistically plural pre-colonial culture with very few centralized structures, and there was little social need for monumental sites. But there certainly is an efflorescence of vernacular architecture, although much of it has been decimated by metropolitan erasure and ecological damage. Batanes is a wonderful exception. Next slide. And you also see in the Philippines intangible cultural heritage in the form of ritual, ornaments, functional traditions, chants, scripts, weaving, jewelry making, tattooing. And there is this emphasis in pre-colonial Philippines on focusing on the body as the bearer of status. And what do I mean by status? I'm referring to notions of power and beauty. Next slide, please. So here you see a Bagobo man and woman in early 20th century. Next slide, please. So monuments as such are a much later phenomenon. And you see it, you see it in the Islamic sultanates, in the mosques and homes of sultans from the 13th century onwards, which is then followed by 350 years of Spanish rule. But it's interesting that the Catholic majority rarely deemed Islamic architecture to be part of what later would be called the Filipino nation. That's from the 1870s onwards. Next slide. So what you see is the Catholic enculturation of the public sphere, right? So on the one hand, our Constitution says that there is an absence of state religion and that there is an inviolable separation of church and state, and we believe in religious tolerance and inclusivity. But certainly, even the very first line of the preamble, Almighty God, is clearly a Christian reference, right? Because many of our cultures are animist and don't necessarily think along those lines. So what you see in the Philippine Registry of Cultural Properties for the Bangsamoro, a woefully small number of Islamic heritage sites. Many of them have deteriorated from political conflict and ecological damage, and ultimately because of sluggish investment by the state in their restoration. Next slide, please. So what do we account, how do we account for this general refusal to challenge Catholicism even after Rizal? And that means even the decadence of some in the church hierarchy is not subject to scrutiny. And you see in the Philippines, alarmingly, the persistence of inequality, which is not only socioeconomic, but symbolic. And it suggests to me that critical inquiry is strongly discouraged. And what you want is submission and obeisance. And you see this in this constant pitting of hierarchies, and even when Filipinos introduce themselves, it has to have every title that they have has to be mentioned in a lengthy preamble. And I would suggest that, it's very status oriented, and I'd like us to think about that. So if under Spain, the civilizing mission, if you will, of Spain centered around religious conversion, when the Americans came to the Philippines, what you see is the secularization of public space. Next slide. So in the American era, you see all this critical infrastructure and institutions, government buildings, ports, forts, bridges. It's very similar to what the British did in India on the level of violence and on the level of construction. So you see, of course, and my friend Ian Morley talks about this, Daniel Burnham's plans for Manila and Baguio after the City Beautiful movements in San Francisco and elsewhere. But ultimately, and more importantly, is you see the strategy of US colonial and early capitalist project is to domesticate and contain Filipino elites. How? Through the secularized public school system and with English as a medium of instruction. So naturally, that becomes a tool for eliciting collaboration. Next slide. The Japanese occupation, you see very few monuments of comfort women. So in 2018, I will be discussing at greater length how the government pulled down a comfort woman statue and marker that had been put up by private entities. And that year, 2018, another statue in Laguna, 2 days after its unveiling, was taken down, also of comfort women. And why is it only other former comfort women and advocates helping them who have raised a public outcry? Where is the outrage among the rest of the population about these summary removals? And again, this stands in stark contrast to the proliferation of Japanese memorials, gardens, shrines, honoring the dead and Filipino-Japanese friendship. Next slide, please. So all that's left, apart from a few lines in Department of Education endorsed textbooks, which I don't have the time to get into here, all that's left really is one obscure historical marker on the upper right. And then you have below the makeshift marker that was made by the Comfort Women and their supporters after the statue was taken down in 2018. And on the upper left, you see a statue of two women on private property in Panay. That's it. Next slide, please. So, have we really effectively decolonized? I mean, when you consider that the very notion of the Filipino nation was predicated upon and determined by colonial incursions and monuments depicting imperial, religious, and national prestige are always being are often being protected and lauded, and to some degree this suggests that it leads to a kind of neo-colonial obeisance on the part of Filipino elites. So you say, well, but what is Filipino identity? When you move beyond what it is fighting against, what is it in an immanent sense, in and of itself, in a self-reflexive manner, rather than using colonialism as a point of reference? And what does the conventional urge to archive objects and add to collections according to an accepted nationalist narrative that ultimately accommodates rather than opposes colonial rule suggest? Next slide. So in the Philippines, you see the UNESCO World Heritage Sites, at least with respect to built heritage, primarily focus on the concerns and histories of colonial and social elites, with the exception of the rice terraces, which is a longer conversation that our friend Stephen Acabado has done wonderful work on. Next slide, please. So essentially what I'm saying is and I think of people like John Lee Candelaria and John Lynn Antud, where, essentially they've talked about this with reference to different periods, but we have very few monuments and sites commemorating colonial incarceration and oppression, or state incarceration and oppression. So it's always about celebrating the person who is heroic, rather than those who suffered under certain kinds of oppression. So the question is, how will you remember the heroism of a figure if you don't acknowledge what it is they fought against? So what we see is primarily the sites where violations took place are often not celebrated. And in that sense, we are very different from the rest of the world, hence the word peculiar, because, in Australia, you see convict sites being recognized. You have not just Auschwitz and Birkenau, but you also see, like in ICOMOS US, you see this desire to look at civil rights movement in places like Alabama. Next slide, please. So I propose that we make a distinction between heritage and history. And there are things that rise to the level of heritage and social histories that don't. And I suggest that it is not only formal reasons. I have 10 minutes left on it's not just formal reasons. It is to do with what is being represented. So again, in the National Historical Commission website, you see things like, emblazon and heraldry division. And, it's sort of quaint and feverish and an attempt to find a bombastic and pompous sense of identity, right? But if you look at all the national shrines recognized by the National Historical Commission, they're all male historical figures. And the question also is, why on earth would you call it a shrine? A shrine in Hinduism is a space in which you express your devotion to a deity, or a Christian shrine is a nativity. But what does it mean when these secular figures are deified in shrines and therefore cannot be subject to scrutiny? You look at our national monuments, it's the same thing. Next slide. So, interestingly enough, we don't have a single national hero in the Philippines. And, in 1995, there was an effort to recommend 9 historical figures, 7 of whom were men and 2 of whom were women. As you know, Rizal and Bonifacio came out as the clear frontrunners in this debate. Next slide. But the fact that there has been no legal pronouncement about who the heroes are is a source of concern, because it means that there's this fear that there'd be all of these requests that the Department of Education and the National Commission of Culture and the Arts had to sift through. They didn't want to deal with debates involving historical controversies. And really, what does this mean? Is it intellectual laziness with the rigorous vetting required? If this was done in 1995, how is it that this is still unresolved? And there is a fear of giving credit to groups other than one's own. So again, it brings us to a very parochial tendency to think in terms of the self in opposition to the others. Next slide. So I would suggest that, heroization is really a useful pedagogic instrument in the myth-making machineries of many states. And so you valorize glorious victories and heroic defeats. But most of the heroes hail from the social elite. And more importantly, you're really talking about a great deal of male activity. Until recently, women were not a part of much of these spaces. Next slide, please. So look at the gallery of heroes in Rizal Park. There's not a single female figure. Next slide. So who are the women who have been commemorated? So we have Gabriela Silang, we have Tandang Sora, And what you observe is, they are related to important historical figures, but of course, they themselves either fought or nurtured, fought colonialism, or they nurtured those resisting it. Next slide, please. And you have other women connected to powerful men. I don't have so much time, so I'm going to whisk through this. Next slide, please. Now, but I do want to talk about the notion of heroism as defined by the government. So in 2021, there was an exhibit portraying the faces of heroism in the Second World War. And who were the women who were portrayed? So you see there's a spy, there is a commander, there is gave shelter and medical treatment to guerrillas. Next slide. And of course, someone who was a scientist, and you have someone else who was a medical doctor and did both care for the guerrillas while working officially with the Japanese. Next slide, please. So you have to say, well, what about people, women like Gregoria de Jesus from an earlier period? I mean, she was not only the wife of an important historical figure, but she was a custodian of the seal and the documents of the Katipunan, which is a revolutionary organization against Spain. Why is her bust discreetly tucked away in the NHCP's Museum of the Katipunan? And her remains are inconspicuously in Manila's North Cemetery. So possibly it's because there's this debate about Rizal and Bonifacio and a general preference for Rizal. Possibly her obscurity has to do with the fact that she married again after Bonifacio's death. But I would propose that when female figures are caught engaging in sexual activity, whether it's consensual or forced, they become sullied. And that requires their containment. And later I will talk about the notion of hiya, a shame, and the desire to cover things and sweep them under the carpet. Next slide, please. So what you see really is acceptable female leaders are either maternal or they fought the anti-colonial resistance, right? Virtually all of them were from the educated middle class. And it's certainly one surmises that Gregoria de Jesus was still ultimately insulated from the type of violence you see towards women who come from poorer classes, such as the comfort women. These victims are stripped of historical agency and they're blamed for their disempowerment because it gives rise to a sense of national helplessness and shame. In other words, ikinahihiya natin sila. We are ashamed of their story. So this may explain why you see so little of these comfort women narratives since the 50s. And it exposes an unspoken but strictly observed caveat. While these women may be footnoted in social history, they can never be allowed to rise to the level of national heritage. Next slide. So you have this comfort woman statue. 2017, it was erected by several private entities, NGO and private. And 4 months later, it's pulled down. And it's pulled down in the middle of the night, 10 p.m. at night. And it's ostensibly transferred to the home of the sculptor. And the sculptor claims later that it was stolen from his studio, causing him to fear for his safety. And I'm going to explore this idea of fear a little bit later. This artist actually continued to produce many commissioned works for national government agencies. So if he was so afraid, he wouldn't have done so, I suggest. Next slide, please. So when the Manila City government, which is subordinate to the National Historical Commission, confiscated the marker, one might have expected the National Historical Commission to make a comment. After all, they're a national body, and the Manila City government is subordinate to it. And the point is, if you read the law is very clear. You can't do anything like that. The National Heritage Act, Cultural Heritage Act stipulates that you can't do that unless you have a permit from the National Commission on Culture and the Arts. There's no evidence that the Department of Public Works and Highways ever secured a written permit. Next slide. So you see the statue. This is before it was dismantled. You see it's a Komatsu tractor. This was April 27, 2018, and it was taken down at about 10 in the evening. And this gives you an idea of what happened. Next slide, please. So why did these government agencies get involved? Essentially, from where I sat, I could see that, the Asian Development Bank's Board of Governors meeting was happening shortly thereafter. And the ADB president did not want the memorial as a precondition for Japanese loans. And again, this is the political economy of erasure. The Philippines receives the highest overseas development assistance from Japan, as you can see, to the tune of 260 billion yen for the calendar year 2021 to 2022. So that certainly is an incentive. Next slide. So what happens to the narratives of all these women in a primarily Catholic male canon, especially when they're poor? Why do we allow some subjects to be deemed less grievable than others? Next slide. So, because of the time, I'm going to whiz through this, but I'm essentially saying, well, what ordinary people have been commemorated, when and where? So you do see some which merit, they merit recognition because they commemorate victims and survivors. Next slide. What about the anti-Marcos anti-martial law EDSA 1 commemorations. Broadly speaking, I would suggest that the markers and monuments primarily depict certain elites. So if it's not Senator Ninoy Aquino, it's Cory Aquino, followed by media moguls like Henny Lopez. Next slide. And of course, you have what you call the phenomenon of discarte, meaning literally to make do, usually in the context of precarity. You have local governments and private funders with the Catholic Church working together in the business of memory making. So Mayor Alfredo Lim certainly was important in recognizing different leaders in the resistance to Marcos. And you have Mayor Atienza, also was very important. Slide. Next slide, please. So you have in the legislative branch, you have people like Lisa Masa who use their pork barrel to renovate the Charlie Del Rosario building, which is who is the first person who disappeared under martial law. And you have the Bantayog ng mga Bayani, which is a private entity in Quezon City. Next slide, please. So I want to recognize the very valuable grassroots effort, the anti-Chico Dam's struggle heroes monument in Kalinga, featuring 3 leaders who resisted the Chico River Dam project of Ferdinand Marcos in the 70s and 80s. Very interestingly, the monument was unveiled in 2017, but it was demolished by the Philippine National Police, allegedly, in early 2021. And I think what is really important and noteworthy about this example is that the communities themselves works to restore the monument just in time for the Day of Valor celebration in April of 2021. Next slide, please. Okay, so the crux of the matter is that Muslim Filipinos, who we consider to be the political and cultural other of the imperial center, where are commemorations of their experiences, their traumas, their memories, if we are in the business of honoring the traumas of others? Now, of course, there has been efforts on the part of certain government administrations to bring their interests into the national fold. But the point is that, for instance, Noynoy Aquino, in attempting to honor the victims of the 1968 Jabida massacre, he, instead of identifying what had happened and what happened to these poor recruits who were gunned down by their military handlers in Corregidor, what you see is this erasure. Suddenly, it's morphed into the Mindanao Garden of Peace with no reference to the government massacre of these Muslim recruits in the marker. Next slide. So here is an important point, and this brings me to a great deal of research that I have been doing. So all of these people said that they merited money from the Philippine government. Only 11,000 of these 75,000 were acknowledged by the government. But again, it brings us back to the notion of the political economy of inclusion and exclusion, right? How can an indigenous person or a Muslim from Mindanao who provide government with adequate paperwork when most of them were destroyed by villages or they were fleeing bombing and raids and evacuated? So you have a scholar, Thomas McKenna, who wrote Murder or Martyr. And he says, well, actually, a conservative estimate of the amount of Muslims killed during the Marcos years is about 120,000 deaths. So my question is, why has that not been talked about? Why are they not counted? And in the 1974 Takbil Mosque massacre in Palimbang, which I studied quite carefully, why is it only the mosque where 1,500 men were killed that is considered to be a spatial marker for trauma and memory, when twice that amount of women and children were raped and thrown overboard at sea? So my question is, why are such women necessarily less grievable? And you see this makeshift marker, and again, back to the notion of discarte and making do, you see this marker that was put up by a political group, the Moro National Liberation Front, and the Takbil family. But why do they have to make these makeshift efforts? Where is the state in terms of honoring them as human beings whose experiences are part of the Republic? Next slide. So the National Historical Commission, its silence to such experiences has to be looked at in contrast to the unveiling of 34 markers recognizing the Elcano-Magellan circumnavigation of the globe and the pathway in the Philippines. If they have the time and the money to do that, why can they not honor other Filipinos who are less privileged? And again, where do we see in those markers a description of the violent displacements of colonial rule? It's noteworthy that the artist who made the Comfort Woman statue in 2018 that was pulled down, he made it in 2017, it was pulled down in 2018. That artist who claimed that he was fearful for his life is one of two artists who did the relief work for these markers. So I would suggest that perhaps he is not as fearful as he says. Instead, it seems to me that the artist agreed to work with the National Historical Commission, bow down to the removal of the Comfort Woman statue, in return for which, in the manner of quid pro quo, he would be paid to do all of these markers throughout the archipelago. Next slide. So I need to move forward now and essentially just say who or what are deemed worthy of memorialization by the state. What ordinary human beings have been recognized in our statues and our markers. Yes, there are a few examples, and there are some that are community driven, like the marker of Pian de los Santos in Caloocan. Next slide. So really, I'm at the end. I know I'm way over time, but I just want to say, why should we demonize anyone? If you think of Medeo Cruz and how he was demonized for questioning the Catholic Church, all I'm saying is everything should be subject to scrutiny, the self, the other, the many others. And so in the same manner that we critique colonial history and capitalism, we should be able to critique the church. I do not recommend that we dismantle churches and other monuments. I am simply suggesting that we should have a fuller discussion and contextualization of their history. I'm suggesting that we reflect multiple voices. When any historical event is commemorated or any historical figure is recognized. As you can see, sites of conscience are being mapped all over the world. And that therein lies our peculiarity, is that we're too embarrassed to do that, except for certain kinds of legitimate suffering. If it's, we certainly don't like women who have been raped. We definitely don't like it when they're poor and raped. We prefer that they're English speaking and Tagalog speaking from Luzon and the Visayas. The Mindanao survivors are not necessarily part of the national discourse. But I propose that the only way to heal from traumatic memory is if we identify and acknowledge it first. How are you going to remember heroism if you forget the contours of what was being resisted? Next slide. So I have a number of examples. We can talk about them in the Q&A, but for example, I mean, we seem to have forgotten the Filipino-American War. And, you know, it's as if, you know, MacArthur came and saved us and we all lived happily together, but not really. I mean, look at the history of what happened in Batangas and elsewhere. Next slide. I suggest not just the Bataan Death March, but also the prisoner camps under the Japanese. I suggest the Red House in Bulacan, where numerous women were held and violated during the Japanese occupation. Next. And we should have more minority groups, indigenous peoples, non-Catholic religious denominations, non-elites. So we should rethink bronze and stone. After all, as early as 1994, you know, Japan was already talking about wood as an important material that is worthy of restoration and prestige. And ultimately, we need to think about the idea of a cultural landscape, meaning a monument and site with the intangible cultural heritage that accompanies it. I would suggest that we expand our thinking beyond archaeology and architecture and open up to the idea that anthropology and cultural studies has a great deal to teach us about the performance of memory. Next slide. So, final thoughts. I know my moderator, I don't mean any disrespect. I'm at the end. I would suggest that our historical markers must convey multiple and contested interpretations of history. I would suggest that these markers need to be longer, clearer, more nuanced, and in more than one relevant language. Okay, if you want to have English and Filipino, certainly, but the vernacular language as well in that respective site. We need to question our automatic acceptance of state, church, and donor-driven initiatives when it comes to thinking about what merits recognition. We have to resist the e-palling of monuments and sites. Next slide. So finally, I think we really need to think about heroism beyond the revolution and beyond EDSA 1. Why have we stopped identifying them? Has time frozen? It shouldn't. We should be able to think of contemporary ethnicity and contemporary figures that are worthy of emulation. So I would suggest also that some measure of iconoclasm is necessary for decolonization, not destruction, but scrutiny. We have to remember that all human beings are human, all too human. We're all flawed. And it's not a static matter of I am the oppressor, you are the oppressed, or I am the oppressed, you are the oppressor. All human beings have the capacity to be oppressive. And the discourse of power is such that there are no static subjects. So I would suggest that we vigilantly watch ourselves and ask ourselves, why do we even need heroes? I'm not saying that they are not important, but I am saying make sure that honoring them is not an excuse for avoiding what Sadko would call the burden of freedom to think for yourself. Be wary and conscious of romanticism as a secular form of idolatry. And finally, I suggest that it's time for us to move away from the state's historicist obsession with select heroes towards a far more expansive definition of cultural heritage. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Lila. That was an absolutely compelling lecture. I will postpone the point I want to raise about even the role of the erasure of memory and the kind of black hole that it creates in the psychic firmament of people. Because I think that even forgetting becomes an active and memorable act. No. But to join in the discussion, I would like to welcome Ms. Maria Cristina Paterno, or Tina, President of the International Council on Monuments and Sites, ICOMOS Philippines, and Mr. Eric Akpedonu, member of the faculty of the Department of Fine Arts, the Ateneo de Manila, and treasurer of ICOMOS Philippines.
Thank you,
Thank
John.
you, Don. Thank you, Lila, for your really tight synthesis of your perspective and a kind of situational analysis of commemoration of heritage. It's really timely. How do you want to proceed with this, Eric? Because we're a little behind.
Well, we just go ahead as planned and just delay our lunch for a few minutes.
Okay. For the benefit of the audience, can I start? Because people just were coming in throughout the talk, and some had just recently arrived. No, so for the benefit of the audience, can I start out with a clarification of terms? The audience is very broad in discipline, and not everybody's from the field of heritage. So maybe we can clarify decolonization in the way that you mean it in this talk, because the term has, well, undergone various connotations. No, initially it was used to describe the process by which colonies freed themselves of colonial rule, and now it has moral, philosophical, and social tones. On the one hand, there's the more radical use of the term that everything pre-colonial is our true heritage, and the heritage that speaks most strongly of colonial oppression should be relegated or removed. That's not what you're talking about here, just to be clear for everybody. And what you really mean when you say decolonization is not, is to recognize the effect of that colonial past and to question the ideologies that we might still be subject to and ask if it still serves us. So in the end, it's not an act of deletion or subtraction of or tearing down, but a conscious integration and reinterpretation of the various layers and perspectives, right? Okay, just to be clear. Eric, would you like to say anything, or I can go on?
I should just go on for now, and then when you're done, I can also chip in my 50 cents worth of view.
Okay, so I really agree on the need for deeper discussions, for multiple and contested interpretations of history. And I wonder how much of that is possible given the heritage infrastructure, no? Because what's required for that is for full-fledged representation is maybe more support than current budgets allow. Just agreeing on historical appraisal alone, developing an interpretation strategy and training, decentralizing that training, no? And I'm glad for your recommendations of sites to memorialize, and that's one way. And I don't want to say an easy way, because then if it's done with the non-nuances, then would it serve the same purpose? I think I'd like to suggest also another one on that list, which is evolving more meaningful statements of significance. Currently, all our structures are guided, their restorations, how it's restored, what parts must be saved, how it will be interpreted, are guided by a statement of significance. And sometimes they're rather thin, you know, their names, their dates. And I suspect where some statements could benefit from the lens of decolonization. Often, you know, when we looked at some of the reports of the national agencies, a lot of it had to do with names, dates. This is the first, this is the biggest, or this is the oldest. And I think it's time to look into not just rarity, but what makes it truly exceptional and valuable, and linked to a broader context of meaning. I also appreciate what you said on how we commemorate without acknowledging the other side. What is the very thing that they fought? And I think it's much easier to interpret something in black and white, but reality never is. It's always easier to portray a hero or a villain than to portray a complex character or a complex event that was a product of its time. And the question here, no, because usually decolonization connotes equality in representing all sides, bridging the us versus them, as you mentioned. But the subtext here really is ensuring that the voice of the underrepresented is brought to light. But what about the voice of the one that had the power the sacred cows, and the ones who were already overrepresented. I think the tendency is to sideline that perspective. And I think there should be a space for that, because in compensating for that voice, drowning out that side of the equation, we lose the possibility for education for future generations. You know, when I visited museums in South America that commemorated the desaparecidos, those who were detained or tortured or killed during various regimes, they had as their slogan, "Never again," which is a common global slogan that commemorates the underserved, no? And it's certainly heartrending to hear their stories and what transpired. But what I, as a visitor, was most interested to hear and understand was the view of the other side, the view of the perpetrator, the view of the state on why it was necessary. What did the lieutenants have to say? They followed orders. And including that voice and interpretation is certainly a difficult and painful thing to do. But if it's absent from that story, then the potential learning is diminished. And because memories are short, history repeats itself. And should something like that ever happen again, how will that situation present itself? It will look very differently than what is presented in that museum, right? It will look like a good idea. It might look like the promise of security from a magnified threat. So I think it's also important to link this to the broader context of the world. What was that like? What were its rosy beginnings, and how did it devolve into that painful reality? Agree for your note on Bangsamoro. When ICOMOS reviewed the big picture of sites on the National Registry, there's only one mosque out of 89 religious sites, and the rest are Catholic churches. So Bangsamoro has 0.2% of the total listings on the registry. That's it. Commemoration of heroes that overcame colonial oppression. I wonder if also part of the reason we present it this way is aspirational. It's certainly more enjoyable to celebrate than it is to sell to an LGU to become the site of a painful memory that its residents will walk by every day. I mean, could it be that simple? I mean, these are overcoming oppression and triumph. I mean, these are the arcs of, these are accessible storylines, you know, of fiction, of movies. And there's a reason for that. We as people demand that. It's what we enjoy and what we want. You know, it's easy. So that's it for me.
Can I respond, or do you want? Oh no, Eric first, or
No, you respond. Don't worry. Otherwise, we might lose the thread.
yeah. Okay, Tina, thank you so much. You said so many different things, so I'm gonna. The first thing about the voices, you're absolutely right. I don't think it should be, one voice over another. What I am suggesting is a multiplicity of narratives. So I am not saying that when you honor a colonial monument, that you drown out that colonial voice. No. That is your master narrative. What I am saying is there are multiple eclipsed narratives that have to be allowed to surface. And absolutely, you are correct about budget and, just how difficult this becomes in practice, but other countries are doing it. And there's no reason why we can't learn. I mean, you simply say for a given monument, who are the stakeholders with contested views of history vis-a-vis this monument? Fill in this form, get them to submit their perspective, their narrative, and then have national agencies vet it. I really think, like all throughout the country, you see these markers in Filipino, and so many of the people that I've talked to, they don't even know what the marker is about. So, but I think also that there are a number of things that make it difficult for us to get UNESCO World Heritage sites. And part of it is that UNESCO itself is very Eurocentric in its definition of universality. I mean, what do you mean when you say universal? Why is there a preference for deep archaeological time rather than things that are more recent? And Filipinos, really, if you want us to move ahead in the World Heritage Zone, then it's important to know that we've got to put the importance of buffer zones inside the National Cultural Heritage Law. I mean, it's a little bit absurd if the UNESCO demands it, but the LGU and the national government say, well, we have no legal right to, so there are certain practical things we can do, like start thinking spatially in terms of our urban landscape, incorporating the notion of buffer zones. Finally, I also want to say that, like in Rwanda, there was this phenomenon called gachacha, which, the Tutsis and the Hutus, after the genocide, they had to sit down and there were not enough courts to try every human being who felt victimized by the process. And so there was, you call it transitional justice, where you have a more ad hoc way of getting different groups to sit down, Tutsi, Hutu, and say, well, this is what happened. This was my perspective. This is your perspective. Yes, but I feel this must be enunciated and conveyed. And when that discussion has taken place, the idea is that would lead to a certain kind of healing. Right now, it's a big debate whether it works or not, but I'm just saying that there's no reason why for any monument, or, you can identify conflicting, contested points of view, have a discussion, and then come to a consensus on a narrative that represents different points of view written by those people from different perspectives. And finally, the idea of wanting to find things that we celebrate. There was a photographic exhibit of victims of Duterte's drug war in Baclaran Church. And I went with my husband, Vince, and we just expected everybody to be as traumatized as we are by looking at the images. And alarmingly, people were there and, they were playing games and, just hanging around. And there were these very visceral, stark images of brutality, and people weren't looking. And so I guess what I'm saying is, yes, celebrate, but not to the point of lightness, this unbearable lightness that makes you incapable of any level of gravitas. And I think that at least in literature, which was my first discipline, you're forced to put yourself into the shoes of another human being, because that's what literature is all about. And so it's a discipline that in a way provides you with the tools to have empathy for others. Anyway, so Eric, thank you so much, Tina.
Sorry, I'll react one last to Lila. I agree. Adding those layers of meaning though to existing memorials maybe opens up a space for architects, because there's only so much you can fit in that plaque, right? We're gonna have to think of more creative ways to add these layers in small memorials. So with that, add the floor to the architects.
Well, thank you, Tina. Thank you, Lila, for this very insightful talk. I found it very interesting. And to sum it up very quickly, I totally agree with you that it is absolutely necessary to broaden the horizon of what is commemorable, what should be remembered, and how it should be remembered. Just to give some context, we did a study in Bohol. We were researching on important personalities and built heritage they left behind. And what surfaced again and again is that there were important people who played an important role in Boholano history, except that nobody remembered them because everything is drowned out by the Rizal and Bonifacio cults. You mentioned earlier that why do we even call those shrines? Why is it a Rizal shrine? I think it's a perfectly appropriate name that we are using because we are treating them like saints. And I think that is highly problematic. It's basically a simplified form of nation building, which I think is not very healthy. Obviously, the monuments that are found in every Philippine city, monuments primarily of Rizal, but also those of Bonifacio, are obviously there to help in nation building. But as you rightfully pointed out, at the expense of other groups, of other ethnicities, other religions, giving focus on this particular aspect. So I agree with you. Yes, we need much more variety. We need to commemorate local heroes. We need to commemorate provincial, municipal events, not necessarily always with a marker, but definitely they have to be given more focus, maybe in local teaching. You mentioned the need to decolonize. While it is certainly necessary to decolonize the mind away from whatever comes from abroad is better, white is better, European is better, American is better, I do agree with that. What I do not quite agree with is the notion of decolonializing our monuments, the ones that we have inherited from our Spanish ancestors, from our American ancestors. I'll come to that in a moment. Colonization is indeed a very two-edged sword. In the Philippines, we have a heavy focus on the negative aspects of colonization, although it is not always spelled out very well. So we put a lot of emphasis on those who fought colonialism, Rizal, Bonifacio, the heroes of the revolution. Although, as you rightfully pointed out, we do not really talk about much of the suffering that came in the wake of this fight, or that actually triggered this uprising. But what is also totally absent, and that goes not only for monuments, but also for our museums, where we narrate the national history, is to look at colonization as something that is not only negative, but also positive. Now, I know that sounds quite blasphemous, but it is a fact, it is a truth, that colonization has advantages. It brings countries into the wider sphere of trade, of technology exchange, trade exchange, DNA exchange, migration. The Philippines is unthinkable without the colonial experience. There would be no Philippines. Spain is pretty much the Judas of the Philippines. We would never have come about if there hadn't been the experience of colonization, and that goes not only for the Philippines, but many of the nation states we see around today. So we should actually erect a monument to Legazpi, as Christianity should actually erect a monument to Judas, because both were instrumental in ultimately achieving what and where we are today. The Pax España brought about the unification of the islands, which may not have happened without it. It brought about massive technological advancements. It brought about ultimately the unity of the country, for better or for worse. Would there be a Philippines today if it hadn't been without Spain? Very unlikely. We could go on for that for quite a while. The point I'm trying to make here is that it is not only necessary to commemorate the suffering, and I totally agree with you in that regard, but we should also put up monuments that celebrate colonialism. In fact, quite a number of countries are quite comfortable with their colonial past. Think of places in the Caribbean, think of places that actually refuse independence, like Martinique, like Guadeloupe. Let's think of countries that are very comfortable with their British past, like Jamaica. Even countries in Africa who have embraced colonialism and the colonial heritage, like Cote d'Ivoire, and who are actually quite happy to be seen as a French version, a Black version of French culture. So monuments to the colonial past are there, and I'm quite happy that the Philippines is comfortable with them. Unlike other countries, which are quite quick to tear down statues from the past, thereby erasing history, erasing memory, in the Philippines, we rather like to leave them where they are, add our own monuments, and that's why our plazas fill up with monuments left and right. Not just go to Binondo Plaza Ruiz, and you hardly have space anymore because everyone is putting up his own version of history and importance. Be it as it is advantageous. I like the approach of the Filipinos, not destroying the tomb of Legazpi, but rather decorating it with the Spanish flag. Unlike the Mexicans, who in a very Oedipal reflex, as you rightfully pointed out, actually desegregated and hate Cortes, even though ironically, Mexicans are pretty much 2/3 Spanish in heritage, in DNA, in culture. So it's quite ironic that a nation that is very Spanish kills the father, as we see in Mexico, whereas one which is perhaps only marginal Spanish, like the Philippines, in terms of ethnicity, actually embraces it. And I definitely prefer the latter. We have to give credit to all layers of history, to the colonial, to the post-colonial, the pre-colonial, because all of those are valid layers of our history, and all of them made what we are today, for better or for worse. There are a few other things that I would like to mention. Tearing down monuments. You mentioned initially the Confederate monuments. I always liked the Confederate monuments in the southern states. And I really regret that people are destroying them because they are erasing history. Putting up a monument is basically putting up your own version of history. Removing them is basically replacing it with somebody other interpretation of history, none of which is necessarily correct. The Confederate monuments, of course, being the rare case where it was actually the loser who wrote the history rather than the winner, which is something quite unique in the history of mankind. This is currently being corrected in quotation marks, not necessarily for the better. So decolonization, we have to decolonize the mind, but we should not decolonize our public environment. We should rather put it in context and embrace it. I would like to see monuments dedicated to, like you said, the Acapulco-Manila galleon trade, monuments perhaps to technology introduced by the Spanish, introduced by the Americans, things that we ultimately all profited from. We also need to reflect and commemorate marginal groups. I totally agree with this on that. Unfortunately, the Philippines is still by itself understanding a Catholic country. Yes, of course, we claim to embrace our Islamic heritage, but the truth is it was the Muslims who for centuries were the, I would almost say, natural enemies of Catholic Philippines in being the Moros, the slave raiders. This may not be PC to say and think today, but the truth is many people in this country, especially in the Visayas, have a major problem with Muslims. It's unfortunate, but that's a fact. I've seen it myself. This is something that needs to be addressed. You mentioned the lack of Islamic heritage that has been declared by the NHCP. That is certainly true, although one must also put in mind that there were very few remaining examples to start with. Most of the historic architecture of Mindanao, of Holo, of Zulu has been lost. Many of them built of organic materials obviously didn't stand the proof of time. Others were lost to war already starting in the Spanish period. And I think if we look at it realistically, the dismal state of Muslim heritage and recognition by the NHCP and the NCCA is pretty much exactly the same as the dismal state of heritage that affects all of the heritage in the Philippines, whether it is Christian, Muslim, or pagan, or Lumad. So with that having said, let's look around, let's identify more of stuff, historic layers that need to be recognized. Muslim, Lumad, Christian, on provincial level. Let's stop thinking only in terms of our national heroes. Indeed, who needs a hero? I think we should all look into ourselves and look for the hero inside our us. So let's leave it as such. These are just some thoughts I wanted to share with you. Maraming salamat po. I really enjoyed your lecture. It's great. I hope we could have more of that in the future.
Thank you so much, Eric. I'm going to respond quickly to this because I want there's so many questions, it seems. So I want to be very clear about my position. I really do not advocate tearing any monuments down. If that was not clear in my talk, I'll say it again. I do not agree with tearing anything down. All I am saying, so I'm not saying we should do what was done to the Robert E. Lee statue, for example. And I absolutely take your point that there were certain things that colonialism did bring to our archipelago. That is an absolutely fair point. All I'm saying is that regardless of whether it is a historical event or a historical figure, we have to get it in our heads that there is always a multiplicity of voices and perspectives, a little bit like Kurosawa's Rashomon, right? So it's like, I think all I'm saying is, if we could have a historical marker on the Legazpi monument that was made it clear that yes, on the one hand, this was, to some degree it was an important moment that needs to be, but what I am concerned about is the unexamined parroting. It's like, oh, the first mass in the Philippines, and it's like, well, what does that mean? Right? So I think, in other words, if you have over 80% of the population as Catholic, of course you have a majority of Catholic monuments. That being said, there are certain demographic realities. Certain percentage are Protestants, certain percentage are Iglesia Ni Cristos. There are ethno-linguistic groups that don't necessarily believe in monotheistic thought systems. And there are Muslims, and their percentage is clear. So, in other words, if there are about 6% Muslims, you shouldn't have 0.02% being recognized. In other words, there's a sort of demographic map. And if I were the head of a cultural agency, I would say, well, and again, when you say there are not many moral structures, it's because you're thinking along the lines, I would suggest, of elite structures. I am not an expert on moral architecture, but what I am suggesting is like a dapay in northern Philippines, right? I mean, that is their perspective of a communal space, right? It doesn't fit our very Europeanized notions of monuments and sites. But what I'm saying is maybe we are the ones in the ICOMOS world who need to broaden and expand our way of thinking. I think that a scholar of Mindanao would be better placed to identify what non-elite structures merit recognition. So the only thing is that everything should have multiple perspectives. And I think that is what cripples our minds. It's like, Marcos bad, Aquino good, Aquino bad, Marcos good. Precisely that manichaeistic way of thinking is our downfall. There is no white and dark. We inhabit a gray zone. It's an amorphous space, and we should be comfortable. We should be secure enough in our intellectuality to feel comfort in what is perceived to be an uncomfortable space. It's you dangle in an ellipse. What's wrong with that?
As they always say, no? In history, there's rarely black and white. There are only shades of gray.
Yeah. Thank you. So I think we can open it up, Dom.
Yes, thank you. Thank you very much. We have a first question from Edwin Paul Cabling II, history instructor at the Polytechnic College of the city of Baliwag. The question is, do you think that the commemoration of monuments can be a big factor to historical revisionism or worse, distortion in this current context?
I think that's a very good question. In fact, one of the things I was going to say while Tina was speaking was that we really, I think, national agents. So the reason why, ideally in government, if executive branch does this, then the legislative branch checks them and the judiciary checks the legislative. Ideally, that's what it's like, an arena where everybody can vet each other so nobody can monopolize resources, right? I think what's happened in the Philippines is that national government works with certain local governments, and local government says, oh, I want to be voted, next round. So I'm going to put this UNESCO monument so that I'll get credit for it. And if you say, well, excuse me, but it's going to take 6 to 8 years to do your dossier, then they say, no, I'm not interested, because then I'm not going to get the credit and it's going to go to the next guy, right? So and I saw this many times during my term. And when you have a local government code that says you're sitting for 3 years, the mayors and the governors are like, well, what's in it for me? Why should I invest in this, right? So what I'm saying is, this is where the national government should not be a tool of local governments. It's that precise collusion. There's so much collusion in Philippine government. I mean, you have family members. One is in the executive, the other one is in the legislative. That's a conflict of interest. In the same way, you cannot have national government patting the backs of local governments, because you do not want monument making to be about aggrandizing somebody's political career. In other words, our role as ICOMOS is to make sure that the narratives of these, for example, victims, should not be hijacked by political ends. So yes, you are correct. It is a problem. And that is, I think, the role of ICOMOS, since a lot of national government agencies aren't doing it, in large part because they don't have a budget. So they say, well, local government wants to pay for it. All right, all right. But it's ICOMOS's role, I think, to say, hey, wait a minute, is this being used to make that governor win a next election? That should not be allowed to happen.
Thank you, Lila. So yes, it is ICOMOS' role to contribute to the critical thinking in this environment of, as you put it, unbearable lightness. So the next question, to follow up to the first question, is, on the remembrance of the Marcos dictatorship, and given the current political situation in the Philippines, how should public historians and memory activists navigate and engage in the public discourse on the historical matter?
Sorry, can you repeat that? I was reading the questions in the chat. I apologize.
Okay, this question number 2.
Yeah.
As a follow-up to question number 1, on the remembrance of the Marcos dictatorship, and given the current political situation in the Philippines, how should public historians and memory activists navigate and engage in the public discourse on the historical matter? I guess the historical matter of the Marcos dictatorship.
Yeah, well, that's another good question. There's a lot of good questions. I believe that the narratives of people who have been abused and disempowered is not the sole concern of those people. I believe that the majority mainstream culture has to be a part of that. In other words, every time there's been some level of injustice, we should all get, we should all be interested in those stories. And so I think the story of the Marcos dictatorship is not only relevant to the people who suffered directly under it. The story of the Marcos dictatorship is relevant to all of us. And of course, the question is, how can we navigate given the climate? Well, I mean, I think we continue to engage, but we have to be careful that the engagements are empirical, that they're respectful, they're substantive, and they're not polemical. But I think if as an organization we can present a certain, I mean, these are empirical facts. I don't even, I'm not quite sure why the opposition did not use so many of the facts available to them. But I think we should continue saying what we think about what happened during the Marcos senior years, even in this administration, especially in this administration. Thank you.
Thank you. The third question is from Marlon James Creencia. Question is, do you think memorial shrines or monuments for all deceased Philippine presidents should be erected in their hometowns, so that not only Manuel Quezon and Emilio Aguinaldo get all the attention of Filipinos who are prone to forgetting their history lessons, but also the ones after them?
That's exactly what I'm saying. I mean, why did that happen? Because the Quezons put money. It's like, the Romulos put money. But that's not that, in other words, where does the national government, national government is not an instrument of the elite. It has to vet the proposals of different elite groups. I don't think that, even Quezon has a very checkered history. If it were up to me, yes, every president should have a monument in their hometown, but that monument should have multiple perspectives. Thank you.
Thank you. I think for our fourth, and I believe this is going to be our final question, right? John and Ken. The fourth question from Kenneth Balsazar, architect and member of the faculty at the College of St. Benilde, the School of Architecture. The question is, in relation to the current state of Filipinos' knowledge and culture and heritage, in a practical sense, what do you think or suggest would be the priority strategy for an ordinary citizen to influence his or her community to uplift and improve their perception on this cultural matter, hoping that such strategy would contribute to the collection of narrative on our heritage and eventually affect our way of doing things in cultural preservation work?
That's a very broad question. What individuals should do, I think, I say let 1,000 flowers bloom. I say let everybody who wants to express themselves, and share it with whatever community or communities they choose to. I think before that community-driven question, the big problem to my mind is that young people in primary and secondary school in the Philippines are not taught in DepEd issued textbooks what heritage sites are, right? So, and I experienced this when I was in government, that when I, as former UNESCO said, would say to DepEd, can you please put UNESCO World Heritage Sites as well as Memory of the World, as well as this, they would say, yes, but that's culture and we're education. You see? And so what happens in this world, you see it in the field of medicine, you see it in the field, so many different aspects of our lives, is that everything is so compartmentalized. But what if it's a very broad question, like poverty or culture, right? There are intersections between culture and education. And to my mind, I think that curriculum development has not progressed since any post-EDSA administration has not really focused on education. And so, in other words, before you can have an individual expressing what they want to say, there should be some basic information that they're taught in schools. Thank you.
Thank you. Okay, we have question number 5 from April DePena. It seems we have a few more questions. The question is, from some of the topics highlighted, such as decommemorization, a top-to-bottom approach, it seems like the national government is a perpetrator of denying certain parts of our history, especially those that merit painful memories. Collectively, what are other solid ways for us to counter such unilateral action? Do you think this direct and indirect action of the national agencies reflects the kind of sentiment that the public also portrays toward our history, particularly in our historical markers? And what are your thoughts about nationalism being a driving force to somehow give license to the destruction of certain historical markers?
Nationalism as an excuse for destroying certain markers?
Yes.
I
What
don't
are your
think
thoughts about nationalism being a driving force to destroy certain markers?
I don't think markers have been destroyed. I think markers have been incredibly simplistic. I don't think there's been much energy or political will. I mean, there's so little knowledge and interest in the markers that I am suggesting we make them interactive and interesting and engaging to young people. I mean, why spend all this money on them if they're not going to be noticed and read? Now, I think nationalism has been a tool for nation building. And to Eric's point, nation building is not necessarily a bad thing. I mean, there are many good things about nation building. It's just a question of expanding your definition of who is included in that republic. And who is not. So yes, national agencies need to be more objective and disinterested. So there's got to be a vetting process. It can't be, I have money, make a statue of me. You know, that cannot be, it has to involve a wider discussion with communities. So again, it brings me back to the role of ICOMOS, that it's really, if they're not going to do it because they're constrained and they have to follow their principles, in this case, specific political leaders, then it's really up to ICOMOS to vet what is being built. And why? And what is the historical documentation that warrants this expenditure? Now, local government expenditure, we cannot really we have no sway over, but I would venture to suggest that we do over national government expenditures. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Lila. On that point, on the point of the role of ICOMOS to vet and to really contribute to the need for objectivity and how we think here in this environment of what you say was the manichaeistic. I really like the term the unbearable lightness of things, which explains many things in this country. But on that point, thank you very much. You had me actually with the first image of Saint Benedict and his iconoclasm, because I worked on a church on Saint Benedict, so this is new to me about the demolition of the statue of Apollo. Anyway, I just want to thank you, Lila. That is fantastic, and really, when you come back to the Philippines on your next visit, we must get together as ICOMOS and further this very, very, very relevant discussion.